Hi, welcome to the Roller Skating Channel. My name is Bill, and today we're going to do 101 roller skating maintenance. Okay, so you went shopping, you looked over the internet, you went crazy, pulled your hair out, and finally you bought some skates. So, I don't have any new ones because of COVID, but you pull your skates out of the box, and they look pretty good. So now I'm going to explain what the ingredients are, basically. This is a roller skate. And the most important thing to remember about this thing is, and we'll get into it a little bit later, they steer. Unlike blades of any sort, they steer. I suspect that skateboards became skateboards because of roller skates. So, when I say steer, I mean this. If you put pressure on the outside of your leg, the wheels will turn and your leg will go out. If you put pressure on the inside of your leg, the wheels will turn and your leg will go in. It's something really important to remember, but we'll get into that later. Now, in the beginning, I've got a breakdown, and I'm just going to skip around the corner here and show up again. These things consist of a number of parts. The first part is the boot. Then there's the plate with the trucks mounted, the axles and the bearings on it, and the toe stop. And we've broken down again. Here's the plate again. And here's trucks and axles. We're going to get into this a little bit more. Okay, now we're going to do a rundown in a little more complicated fashion. This particular part is the plate. This is a plate with the trucks on it and all the parts required, and a toe stop, and a missing bushing. Now, as we go along, I'm going to find these things. So what happens here is, if this little rubber bushing that fits in there is worn out, that happens, and you lose control of your skates. So we'll work on that later. Breaking them down even more, this truck, basically, these ingredients. Here's the kingpin that holds it into the bottom of the plate. Here's the washer that goes on right there. Here's your compression bushing, which is there. Here's the actual truck, which is there. Here's another compression bushing, which is this one. Then there's a top washer and a locking nut. And all that makes up, basically, the trucks. Going a little farther, we have bearings and wheels. I've cut a wheel in half, actually, to show you how the bearings fit in. There are two sizes of axles normally used in North America. I think it's 17 or 18 millimeters, but you can correct me on that. This is a wheel with the bearings pulled out. The inner part of the wheel that touches the edge of the truck usually has a washer. Then there's the bearing, the wheel, another bearing, and a lock nut. Lock nuts are critical. If these things can be undone by hand, then you better replace them, or use something chemical like lock nut, or some form of material to stop this thing from unwinding as you skate. Because if you lose a wheel, you'll fall, and people behind you will fall over the pieces that fell out of your wheel. Some bearings come with open front and closed front, or closed on both sides. So this is an example of a wheel. The bearings would go in there, and this is a flat spot created by dragging your wheel sideways, and therefore you got thump, 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 thump. But we'll talk about that later. And lastly, we have toe stops, and there's a variety of toe stops depending on what kind of skates are involved. These are designated bell. They are held in by basically a nut or a bolt or a screw. This is a slightly more complicated and highly efficient version that's put in with a lock nut. Again, another tiny one. This is probably from a child skate that goes in with a screw. And these things are called dance plugs. The front of the skate, when you buy it, has a hole for the toe stop. If you take the toe stop out, there's some really sharp teeth, and I don't care whether it's a metal-based plate or a plastic plate. These things can tear into your skin. So what you do is you take this basically plug and you put it in there to stop this from cutting into somebody's skin if you step on them, or digging holes in somebody's precious hardwood floor. Now I'm going to physically break down the skate for you. We're going to take it apart. Your wheels need maintenance. And the bearings need maintenance because you get all sorts of stuff in there. You get hair, grunge, and all kinds of things. So we want to take these off. So what we have to do is take a wrench. All the skates have different sizes, nuts and bolts and stuff. So lefty loosey, righty tighty. So you got your skate. Take the wheel off, like so. And using the nut and bolt, pull it off. Clear out all the garbage that's here. You'll notice this particular pair of skates has a little washer. Don't lose these things. They're hard to find, especially the metric ones. Now we're going to take the bearing apart. If you have a bearing press, that's fine. If you don't, we're going to do it the hard way too. This little pin is like a hook, and it pulls the bearing out. So it goes into the hole, lifts up, and pulls the bearing out. Just like this. And now you've taken the bearing out with ease. So if you don't have the proper bearing press or tools to use, there's another way to do this, but do it infrequently because you can damage your actual wheel. In this case, we take the wheel, and in what I have here is an Allen key, or it could be a screwdriver with a narrow point. Okay, you insert this just deep enough into the hole where the shaft would go, or the axle would go, if you can see that. Just deep enough so that you can pull one bearing only out. And I'm putting a little bit of pressure over here, and the bearing is actually turning up. Then we rotate it a third of a turn, and we do the same thing again. And by doing that, this is what it looks like. You're prying and prying. You rotate it, pry again. So it doesn't come up on a bad angle, damaging the interior of this wheel. The wheel's apart, and the bearings are separated from the wheel, and this is how we're going to do maintenance on the bearings. These little guys, again, some have closed side, some have open side, and some have closed side on two sides. So this will demonstrate it a little more clearly. This is a closed side of a bearing. Now I couldn't find a little one, however this is supposed to be the example. Essentially, it has a C-ring. You have to literally pry the C-ring to get it to go close together so you can lift it out. Okay, that has to be done with an X-Acto knife or something similar. Once you do that, there's a very fine aluminum shield that will come out. Try not to damage that either. Then you actually get to the bearings themselves. And the comparison is, you can see quite a difference here, but in here is where the dirt accumulates, hair, grunge, and you name it. And again on the other side. So what we have to do now is basically clean these. And in order to do that, what you're going to need is some shield for your eyes or your face, and rubber gloves or gloves you can use, because you're going to be using chemicals. And the harshest one I suggest, no harsher than this, would be Varsol. Get yourself a can of Varsol, and then you're going to need some sort of metal tray, preferably metal. I think this is a baking basket, and some brushes, or a brush. And what happens is, you take your Varsol and you pour it in your pan. I'm not going to do it because it smells, but I will put my gloves on. So remember, when you're doing this, you want to do it in a well-ventilated area. And there we go. So you take the bearings, you get them all out of all the wheels, and there should be 16 of them. If there's one short, you got a problem. Put them in here. Pour in your Varsol. You can also use a jar for this, but if it's a glass jar, be really gentle. Let them soak. And while they're soaking, with gloves on, you take the bearing and you start brushing it with your brush. And then you turn it over and you brush it again. And that means you literally want to get into all these cracks and crevices the best you can. So this is an old artist's brush, but it seems to work pretty good. And paintbrushes will probably do something similar. And remember, wear a mask or glasses, because this stuff's going to splash. And whatever you're doing it around is going to smell after too. So, ventilation's critical, and don't do it in the middle of your mother's carpet. Flip it over the other side, do it again. Now, I would let them soak for a day. If you've got a day to do this, let them soak. Come back, once again, stir up a little bit of the Varsol, and when they're in here, clean them again. Flip it over, clean them again. And you're going to see a lot of grunge in the bottom of your pan. Okay, try not to get that back in here. Or you can drain this, strain it, and reuse the stuff that's in there. So now, supposedly this thing is clean. And it's got a little bit of Varsol on it. So watch your eyes, make sure you got your glasses on and your gloves. Spin it. Now this particular giant bearing is burned out, so you're going to hear it. It's also dry. There's no oil in there at all. But it rolls freely. It doesn't go click, 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 which means there's still some dirt in there. And when things are this tiny, I have to do this with 2 fingers, and I spin it. If it spins freely, both ways, chances are it's pretty darn clean. If it goes click, click, or bump, bump, and stops, then you got to do it all over again. So, to do it again, you drop it in, let it soak for a bit, take your brush, do it again. Then, sometimes if you get a brush like this, or even sometimes a fat pencil, you can take the bearing, when it's come out of the Varsol, put it on that and spin it like this in the Varsol container. And that helps get the junk out too. When you're finished, you come out, and whatever you do, you don't take these and use a compressor to spin dry them because they're dry now. Just lay them on a clean piece of cloth, whatever color, I don't care, whatever you can find, as long as it doesn't go through and stain your mom's carpet kind of thing. Let them dry. Then you will take no more than 3 drops of oil on each bearing, and again wipe it down, because when we put it back together, if there's too much oil in these bearings, it's going to spin and splash out all over your wheels and leave an oil track on the floor that the guy behind you is going to face and slip on. Okay, now that the bearings have been cleaned and you've dropped 3 drops of oil in it, let's put them back together. So this particular faceplate, if you haven't damaged it, it should go back on. This stuff is super thin. It's almost as thin as aluminum foil. Place it over the bearing, and this will make a concealed side again. And then the snap ring, or C-ring, or whatever you want to call it, you have to start in one corner, push it down and into it. There's a slot in the bearing designed to carry this thing and keep it locked all the way around until you get it in there where it's sitting properly. If one corner of it's out, that shield's going to come off and grind itself to pieces when you're skating. So you don't want that to happen. I really don't, it's very difficult to take these little things out and put them back in undamaged, but if you manage to do that, you don't want to damage it putting it back in either. So we'll make sure that that C-ring is basically, you can see in here, there's a bit of a locked position or a groove, and the C-ring would go in there. Now I don't have the real C-rings that came from this giant bearing because they were tossed out before I could get to it, but that's the idea. So back again, put the plate on it, start the C-ring here. Hope you can see that. All right, and then push it in the groove all the way around, and it should just snap in right there and stay in, unlike my demonstration purpose here. But nevertheless, if you get it in, great. If you don't, life's hard. So now we've got to put them back into the actual wheel. We've done our oil. The oil's on here. And there's 2 ways to do this. If you have the bearing press, we can go back and press it in. You can start with your fingers, and it's like this. You take one bearing, try to always have the closed side in. If they're both open sides, nothing you can do about that. Start it with your thumbs if you can. Put this one back in. Start it with your thumbs if you can. Then we put it into the press like that, and we press it and spin it to make sure it's straight. Pull it out. It's now ready to put back onto the truck, and it spins freely. Other way is to use, there is a tool that a lot of roller rinks have. It's simply like a little press, and it works like this. Again, you would take the bearings with the protective side out and the protective side out. Sometimes there's a spacer in here. We don't have one in this particular wheel, but it would keep the bearings apart if the wheel wasn't designed not to do that. However, there's none required here, so we'll just put that in like that. Now, this tool, basically you do this and push down so the bottom, the face bearing we call it, face of the wheel, is in. This one isn't quite in. And we press down. Now, they should be done in there very well. So now, if you don't have a bearing press and you don't have this little tool, there's another way to do this. You actually push these in with your fingers if they fit. Try to get them to be flush or flat. You can take this, put it on the truck in the axle, and push it down. And hopefully that'll send the bearing that's underneath up into where it should be. Then you flip it over, and you do the same, and you try to press it down the best you can. Now, if it's still sticking out, it will be in alignment because we have it on an axle, so we're not going to push it down crooked and fight with ourselves. Now you can actually take the locking nut that came off, start it by fingers always, and it's called a nylon locking nut, and righty-tighty with your wrench. We're going to tighten it down a little bit too tight. And you got to be gentle when you're doing this stuff. This also basically compresses the actual bearings together on the wheel, on the axle. So it's doing the same job as the bearing press, only it's doing it in a different place. Now, we've got it so tight that it's not spinning. However, it has compressed the two, and it's in a good position. Now we're going to loosen it off a little bit. Like that, quarter turn. And it spins, but not quite freely. We're going to loosen it off again, quarter turn. Now it spins freely. But we also need some side play, which is, this is awful loose here, but we need it to do this. We don't want too much side play. All we want is a teeny bit. Enough so it just moves fractionally, but it spins freely. It's got to be able to move up, down, just a little bit. So now you've taken all the wheels off, you've done all the bearings, and you put them back on, and they're basically spinning freely. Okay, now we're going to work on the truck and the plate. This particular skate doesn't have special lock nuts. It's only got one, and it's a nylon nut because of its design. You're going to need a set of wrenches, and I hope that you got them when you purchased your skates. If you didn't, you're going to have to figure this one out on your own. However, to undo the trucks, in this case, I take my wrench and I turn to the left. Left loose, right tight. So we're going to take this lock nut off. And all this stuff is better done by hand than with a battery drill or a power drill with a nut driver or whatever on the end of it. Because this stuff, in this particular case, is plastic, and you don't want to strip anything. Some of these things are pretty fragile. So in 100 years or so, I'll have this off. There we go. Now, there. So this again is another nylon locking nut. As we take this apart, it's going to be very similar to this when it's disassembled. There's a washer that comes off. There's the lower bushing. And what you want to do is to take a picture of it if you can, because sometimes the bushings that come off will be the same size, and sometimes one will be bigger and one will be smaller, and you've got to remember where they go. So if you do these one at a time, you can cheat by looking at the back. But in this case, they're both the same size. So I'm taking off the lower bushing. This is how it works. Now I'm taking off the entire truck, laying it down, and the upper bushing and the upper bushing washer. So essentially, this is what we've got. Now, I really don't recommend people purchasing plastic plates. I prefer metal because this sort of thing happens. Now, this is a used skate. But in time, this thing will become wiggly wobbly, and your steering will become a little bit off. There's one other object in here that we have to check and make sure. In here is a kingpin bushing, or a pivot pin bushing, sorry. And that's this little rubber fella here. Now, if this is gone, worn out, this is going to happen. And just that little bit of a turn will play nasty with your steering, and it could cause you to fall. And the pieces that fall out from that deteriorated or worn out bushing could trip the guy behind you or the lady behind you. So you want to make sure that that's in good condition. And we'll take the back off. And pretty much the same story here. Lefty loosey, righty tighty. And it comes off. And while you're at this, you can pick out all the hair and the grunge that's basically entangled itself all over the bottom of your skate. A lot of indoor skating, you're going to find grunge. We have carpets here at Scooters, and there's dust and stuff that gathers on them, and it just can't be helped. So again, there's a nut, a washer, the lower bushing, the truck, upper bushing, and the final washer. And again, this has pivot pin bushing. If that's not in or it's worn out, it's going to wiggle like this, and you're not going to get good steering out of it. When you're doing this, there are some things to watch out for, and these metals do have fatigue and they do break. So in this particular case, this was a 2-week-old pair of skates. And I don't know if you can see this crack. Maybe I'll take off the wheel for you. But the actual metal that this new wheel and skate was made of, it's either fatigue or really low quality. This truck is cracked. Right there. I don't know if you can see the crack. You got to watch out for stuff like this, because in a factory they just slap them together, and you know, we're going to talk about tightening the steering and stuff in a minute, but watch out for stuff like this. Or sometimes the pin's crooked, or there's a really sharp edge on the edge of this pin, and it's going to dig through the little bushing in a quick hurry, and then your steering's going to be screwed up. So keep your eye open for stuff like this. We'll put this back together and just put a nut on it. Sometimes the axles themselves will, if it's an older pair, the axles will spin inside the casing of the truck. We'll get into that later, but there's not much you can do about that. You may have to replace the whole truck. So now we're putting the little darlings back together. So first, on goes the washer. And something else to check too is, if they're older skates, these bushings are supposed to be flat. However, because people go one way all the time in particular rinks, and compression or the steering is pushed down one way, one side of this could be squashed and the other side isn't, and that's when they get hard and you know they need replacing. So you want to make sure that both of these little things, whatever size they are flat. We don't want them to sit crooked like this, because that'll cause your steering and you'll be affected basically. So on goes the bottom bushing, the truck, and the pivot pin goes in the pivot pin hole. And I'm going to really try hard so you can see how this works here. Move that over. You can see the pivot pin goes in there. There. Now essentially it's back in action. So we have to hold it down. So once again, the other bushing, and the washer, and the lock nut. And always start these things with your fingers. And sometimes these gloves get in the way. Sometimes they don't want to participate. Let's try this one here. There, that's better. Sometimes there's a little bit of a burr or some dirt on the end of this nut, or this bolt, and the nut that came off should be the one that goes back on the easiest. So we'll tighten it up in a minute. Once more, we have one washer on the bottom. We have a bushing, and again, it's flat on both sides, not crooked on one side or squashed on one side. Then we have the truck with the pivot pin. The pivot pin goes in there. And it should look like that. And again, we have the lower bushing, we call it, and a washer. And these washers are kind of special because they have a curved edge, and it helps keep the bushing from squishing out when you apply pressure onto it, or squeezing its way out. And that's the lock nut again. Now comes the time when we have to basically adjust the tension so that you can steer. And this is how we do it. In this case, these lock nuts, I guess it's this thing here again, have to be tightened. And you may, if you didn't get tools with your skates, you'll want to get some. I mean, go to your hardware store or whatever, take the skates with you and ask them to match up wrenches with, you know, with whatever size you have. In this particular case, I think this is 9/16. But it's also metric, because everything in Canada is metric now. Most of the planet, for that matter, I suppose. So you could use a socket on this, but always do it by hand. Don't do it by machine, because if you strip that plastic plate or bend it or crack it, you're going to need a new one. So that's just tight enough now to be snug. And we're going to do the same to this one. There we go. If this nut goes on freely by hand, that means the nylon inside of it is worn out. So you better replace it, or it's going to unscrew. This is easier to do when there's no wheels on it, but so now I like to have my heel steering tighter than my toe, because I'm lazy and I spend a lot of time riding around in my heel. So in order to make this work for you, when you want to steer, if you steer to the outside of your leg, which is this side, the wheels turn and your skate goes out. On the inside of your leg, if you put pressure, the wheels turn in and your skate goes in. And that's the big difference between this and everything else. And I believe that's how skateboards got invented too, from roller skates. Now, you want pressure, so there's no real torque wrench or device yet that you can purchase at a safe price to tell you how tight these things should be. And we don't know how long and how old these rubbers are anyway. And I call it, well, it's compression, but I call it squishability. So I'm going to tighten this down. After years of doing this, you know your own weight. So for me, I'm 172 pounds. True, I am. And this is too loose. So what to do is tighten it down too much. But don't go crazy, because you don't want to squish the rubbers right out of where they are. Now there. That's kind of stiff. That should work. This is too loose for the front. In the factory, you don't know what they've done. And probably it's a hard-working person who's just putting them together with an air gun or something, and they don't know how tight they're to be too. So now when you put them on and you steer by pushing down, you don't want your heel to be more loose or to be, you don't want your heel to be too loose. So you want equal steering. And it's up to you now. You have to sit down again, either loosen it off to give better steering or tighten it up to tighten the steering, and skate again. It's a hit and miss game. But what you've done just now is you've basically taken your skate apart, cleaned the bearings, looked for the bushings to be cracked or sealed or replaced or whatever, and then you put them back together. Now this particular truck is pretty simple. It's a very simple design. If you can afford something that isn't plastic down here, it's a lot better. If you can't, go with these till you figure out what you want. Now this toe stop I took off to show you basically that there's teeth here. And you should have some sort of a plug or a toe stop in there to stop that from digging into a person's skin if you fall, maybe your own, or digging into somebody's expensive floor. So this particular stop's called the bell stop, and it's put on with a simple screw. And I can't use new skates because we don't have any at the moment. We've been closed for a while because of COVID, but hopefully we're going to reopen soon. Anyway, you want to put your toe stop back in. Where are we here? Come on. Yeah. So you put it in and you tighten it down. Now, after using these toe stops for a while, they'll get a flat spot on the side. And there's no way to adjust how close it is to the floor. So if it gets a flat spot, I would rotate it to where it isn't flat. Then tighten it down and use it till it gets flat there. And then just keep rotating it and rotating it and rotating it and rotating it until basically there's nothing left to stop you. We've gone over pretty much everything there is to do here. Now we're going to get into the actual boot and laces, and this is really important. Depending on your choice of skate, this particular boot is a high boot and it's a rental. If you can see this bump right here, what I would suggest is if you're buying a moderately priced pair of skates, try to avoid thin plastic. It's going to make your foot sweat, and it gives you absolutely no ankle support whatsoever. If you've got new laces and new skates, hopefully the lace itself isn't too slippery, because that helps it become undone, but nothing much we can do about that. If you've got a chance to buy laces, try to buy a pair that aren't really slippery. They're a little bit tacky, I call it. Now, some people wear this kind of boot with the laces done right up to the top, and that's okay. However, I've learned over the years that with my boot tight all the way, I lean forward to give myself a push. And when I do so, I don't know if you can see this part here, the leather crinkles here. If this is all done up tight, that strand, or those two strands of lace, are going to cut into the front of your ankle. Over time, it can hurt like son of a gun. So what we're going to do is, and what I suggest is, we do the laces up so far, and then we skip an eyelet. In order, you can see the way these things are bent. Some new boots actually have this area cut out, so that you can't make a mistake by doing it all up and it doesn't cut into the front of your ankle when you lean forward and apply pressure. We're going to skip that eyelet like this, and then proceed to continue putting it in the normal holes after that. Now, I'm not going to bother doing it all the way up to the top, but essentially now, if you lean forward, there's a gap here where there isn't two strands of shoelace or boot lace cutting into the front of your ankle. And when boots, if they're not super stiff, you're going to get your ankles cut unless you do something like this, or you've got a pair that have got, like again, like the leather cut out here. So try that and it'll be a lot less painful. The other trick to laces is when you're doing this up, try not to do this. Say you've got them all the way up to where you want them, and then you go like this. You loop this around to take up all the slack, like that, and then you tie it. Well, basically, it may be tight right now, but when you start moving, these laces are going to creep up your ankle and creep up and get up here and become loose. And then everything becomes loose and you can't steer and you're not enjoying yourself. So what I'm suggesting is when you get to where you want to stop zipping these things to the top or tying them to the top, put your bow or your knot in here. And then if you have to take up the slack, you can wrap it around something like that and make another bow or a knot, or you can tuck it in somewhere, or just cut the things off and at home take some heating device or a match or something and melt the ends so they don't fray. But if you, as I said before, if you wind it first and then you tie it, it's going to slip up and it's going to come loose and it could cause you to fall. And trust me, falls are no fun. We've done pretty much everything I can think of on that aspect. If you have a low-cut boot, something like this, you don't have to worry about it because the flexing part of your foot is already there. Now you may, in this case, it's a Velcro strap with a whole bunch of laces and they're awful sparkly and cool. And you can loosen that off, but you don't really need it because the way this particular shoe is designed, or this boot is designed, you can bend forward without too much problem. But once again, with these little things all tied up, you're going to have cutting in the front of your ankle. Well, that was Roller Skate Maintenance 101, and you are watching the Roller Skate channel. My name is Bill, and we will see you again. Until then, roll on.